All right, thanks everyone. So this is new for me as well, doing the remote presentation. So hopefully this all goes well. As Ed said, this is a reprise of a presentation I gave about 4 years ago, I think it was, at First Conference. And it was really talking about teams and culture, some of my experience with that and why I think that is so important. I have been through and updated it a little bit, but it is very much, I think that the content is evergreen. Of course, with the times we live in where we're all working remotely and doing more online, that some of these things may change, but we'll come to those as we go through this talk. So culture gardening, why did I use gardening as a metaphor? So really, I think what I found is I come from a software development background, and I have worked with technical teams, and I've worked with technical leaders, people who have come from technical roles and then moved into leadership roles. And I've found that when people do that, sometimes they think that leading teams is like leading or programming a computer, that it's something where you can touch it, you can feel it, you can see the results. Whereas I believe quite often actually it's much more like gardening. And some of the things that you do, you nurture a team, you grow the team, and it's very much like planting things in a garden. So that's my metaphor, and I'll go on from here, and we'll talk about, first of all, this quote, which is from Jim Collins. It's from a book called Good to Great, which came out in 2002. Now, this book is, I guess, in some ways, a fairly traditional business manual. It talks about lots of businessy things. Collins is very much an expert in how great businesses grow. But what I really liked was this quote, which is, get the right people on the bus, the wrong people off the bus, and the right people in the right seats. And so while Collins looks at lots of things around business strategy and processes, quite often he also talks about the people you work with and the importance of the people you work with and having the right people, but also making sure the right people are in the right places. And actually, another quote which I quite like comes from 3M, who are the people who make Post-it notes. And this is one of their company values. They say, the premise is simple. If your people grow, your company will grow. So the full quote is, of all the pathways to growth, investing in people is our most important. The premise is simple. If your people grow, your company will grow. So people certainly aren't as predictable as a computer, and discovering what you should be doing does certainly take time, energy, determination, and hard work. But the results are definitely worth the effort that you put in. Now, often with these kind of talks, I put in one of these kind of slides, which is a definition. So dictionary definition, what is culture? Because sometimes I think when we talk about these things, different people have different interpretations of what a word means. So what is culture? And the way I'm defining it is, it's the way that people behave every day. So the people in your organization, it's how they interact, it's what they do, it's how they treat other people in the organization. And the thing is that every organization has a distinct culture. And I've worked in probably 5 or 6 different businesses, which each have different cultures. And those cultures are unique. And one of the things before we get started, I think, is to be really clear is you can't transplant somebody else's culture. You can't just take a culture from another company and bring it into your company and hope that it works. Because the factors which make that culture are the people in that organization, and those people will develop the culture as it goes, and taking somebody else's culture just won't work. I think there's a really good example of this actually, which is the so-called Spotify model, which took the world by storm a few years back. And what happened was Spotify started talking about their culture, and they started talking about their organizational shape and the things that they'd done, and squads and guilds and tribes and chapters. And everybody said, oh, that's great. We love that. And Spotify is a successful company and we like all the things they're doing. We'll just call our team squads, and then we'll put in guilds and chapters and tribes. And they tried to replicate the same thing that Spotify had made work for them. But what happened was that nobody was really thinking about why it worked for Spotify or how it might work in their environment. And Spotify themselves have said, actually, this isn't a model. It's not the Spotify model. This is just some things we wrote about at a particular time, and they were things which worked for us. And actually, they've said it was just a simplification of the situation. And this was a number of years ago, and they've certainly moved on since then. So I think if you blindly kind of say, yeah, there's this great culture which somebody else has implemented, we can just do the same, you're probably going to have a hard time. That said, I would certainly advocate learning from what's worked for other companies, but you do need to analyze why something works and how it would fit in your environment. So there isn't really a substitute for the hard work. I'm afraid to say there is no silver bullet. You have to inspect your culture, you have to take actions, and then you have to move it into the direction that you want it to go. So as an example, just because everyone is doing hackathons doesn't mean that you should do a hackathon. Maybe it makes sense for your business. Maybe there's things which people would get out of that. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know. The only people who can answer that are the people in your business. So if your company is looking at new ways of working, and this could be a formal agile transformation, or maybe another change program where you're looking to get people more engaged or different ways of working, getting the culture right is of critical importance. So there's actually research on this. So if you've not looked at the State of Agile reports, so this is released by a company called Version 1, or I think they're now CollabNet Version 1. And they've every year release a State of Agile report. There's another one due in about a month or two's time. But a constant trend throughout all of the years that they've been doing those is that culture is one of the main impediments for successful Agile adoption. So I think the most recent report, which came out around about a year ago, the two top reasons for adoption failure. So one of them was organizational culture being at odds with Agile values. So 52% of people thought that was a reason. And then the other was just general organization resistance to change. And while that's not specifically culture, that's very much driven by the culture and the views of an organization. And somebody I used to work with always used to call it the immune system of the organization. It used to battle against change because of the culture that had been embedded for so many years. So a little bit depressing, but it doesn't mean that if your company culture is at odds with the core Agile values that you have to give up. What it does mean, though, is you're probably going to have to work a bit harder. You're going to have to pay special attention to where the company values conflict with the Agile values, and try and think of ways to transition the culture of the organization. And in my mind, one of the key things around that is focusing on the people, because as I said earlier, culture is about the ways that people behave, and the ways that if you can change people's behavior, if you can change the ways that people think about things and behave and act, you can try and change the organizational culture. So this is where my gardening metaphor comes in. So I'm going to talk about seedlings. So during the early stages of your kind of transformation, and as I say, this might be a traditional Agile adoption, or it may be any other kind of cultural transformation. You'll often come across these views from people. They say, "Oh, that'll never work here," or we've looked at how this company operates, but they're a startup and they all wear jeans and t-shirts, and we're in shirts and slacks, and this is going to be this is never going to work here. Or their people are different. They're in Silicon Valley, they have really smart engineers over there, and that doesn't work for us. Don't fall into that trap. So every company has the capacity to change and grow. If you're a small startup, if you're a large enterprise company, you will have different cultural aspects, but you are able to change and grow. So in your organization, you already have the seedlings which will grow and flourish if you give them the right attention. So pay attention to what you have in your organization. Identify the people who are going to support the change that you're trying to roll out, and try and rally those people to persuade others. Because if you're trying to lead a change program, it's really lonely and it's really hard if you're doing it by yourself. if you can find people and bring them in, even if it's just a loose collaboration of people who you get together once a week and you talk about this change program and you talk about the barriers you're facing, those people are your supporters and they will help you. So get them on board and try to get people to help you out and inspire those early adopters, and they'll bring others along with them. So I actually remember an agile transformation that I went through. It's probably one of the first ones I went through. And we hit upon doubters in the team, as always happens. And the way we were doing the transformation process, we had one team who were trialing new practices, and we were embedding all of those new practices in a new team and getting them to be the first leaders on this. And then what would happen is we'd transplant people from one team to another one to seed new teams. And we'll get on to transplanting a little bit later, but what we found was that there was one person in particular who I remember, and still I remember his attitude, that he was very set in his ways. He liked the way we'd been working, he didn't want to change. He thought we had all been brainwashed, basically. I mean, he just didn't want any part of it. So there's two ways we could have gone. We could have sidelined him and just said, well, this isn't for you, go and sit in the corner, or embrace him. And what we ended up doing was we put him in a team, into that new agile team for a few months. And the difference was just incredible. So from being a huge objector to what we were trying to do, once he'd worked in that close-knit team, once he understood what the team were trying to do, and once he'd been embraced by the team and they'd worked with him, he actually became one of the biggest proponents of the new way of working. So those kind of things can very often happen. You find someone who is an objector to what you're trying to do, but over time, as they work with people on this, they will change their mind. And quite often the people who object the hardest become your biggest supporters. So once you know who's a supporter of what you're doing and who can be swayed either way, you can start to create a team with supporters enough to overcome any opponents. So having a strong coach, and hopefully that's you can certainly sway marginals, but you need that support network as well of other people who are supporting, and you need to build that momentum. So I think that's a really important piece, is just making sure that you look at the people who are in your organization, you identify the people who are going to help you through this, and you try and work on persuading the people who are maybe objecting to it. That said, you're always going to need to hire more people into your team at some point as well. So getting the right people into your business who will help you move forward can certainly make your life easier. By the same token, if you hire the wrong people into your organization, then they could be doing kind of untold damage to the change that you're trying to promote. So it's always really important to try and think about the culture that you want, and to try and hire for the people who will help you create the culture that you want. So don't necessarily hire for the culture that you have now. Think about the culture that you want and how the people that you're bringing into the organization will help you develop that culture. And I think it's really, really important when you talk about hiring that, for me, the most important thing you want to look at when you're hiring people is aptitude and attitude, more so than skills. And I'm talking here particularly about technical teams, because that's a lot of my background. And I've interviewed many people for technical roles. And almost always what I ask them about is not their technical skills, maybe a little bit about what they've done and the experiences they've had and how they think about problems. But I'm much more interested in their personality, their attributes, how they're going to fit in with the team, how they're going to help the team grow, and whether they're going to be a net positive for the team or a net negative. So I always ask a lot more about the personality, because at the end of the day, you can train someone to do a technical task, but you can't as easily change the way someone behaves and thinks. So it's very common in technical roles that you're looking for somebody with 3 years of experience in this particular framework, or 2 years of experience with that language, or experience in this particular industry, or whatever it might be. The fact is, if somebody comes into my team, so we do Ruby on Rails, we do React, we do TypeScript, we do various different languages. If somebody comes into the organization and they don't know Ruby on Rails, for instance, but they're the kind of person who's going to learn quickly, they're going to augment the culture, they're going to help us drive change, and they can learn the technical skills, I'd much rather do that than hire somebody who's a gun at a particular language, but just isn't going to help us on the cultural side. So I focus a lot on this in the hiring activity. And that goes from the very beginning, from the words in job ads, through to the questions you ask at interview, the criteria you have for actually selecting the criteria in the end, or selecting the candidates in the end. So think about the words that you use. Think about the words in your job ads. If you're putting words in like ninja, rock star, kicking goals, killing it, then you're presenting an image of your culture, which may or may not be accurate. But think about, is that the image of your culture that you want to promote? Is that what you're aiming for? Think about how people will read that, how it reflects on you, and whether you're implicitly selecting people in or out of your hiring process through the words that you use. So I think that's one really key thing. Then when you actually meet people, ask questions about their motivations. Think about, what's the best team you've ever worked on? Or what's important to you? Or how do you go about learning? Or what gets you out of bed in the morning? Like, think about them and their motivations, and ask those early. And I would say, if you do a technical screening, do this before you do a technical screening, because I think this is a really important thing, is to first of all get the cultural aspects right, and then think about the technical aspects. I'm just going to pause there because I'm seeing Q&As coming up, and I will attempt to answer these. This is a little bit disjointed as we go, but I would certainly recommend, if you do have questions, please ask them. So, question from Janish. I have a question. When you go into transformation of existing people, what are the challenges one should be aware of or should avoid? Ooh, there's a big question. So, I can click a button here. It says answer live. Ooh, okay. Oh, I am answering it. This is technology.
Just marking
this is great.
Marking is answer.
Yeah. That's good. You see, this is, this is all good. So what are the challenges one should be aware of? Look, I think the challenges are that people don't want to be changed. If you say to anyone, should this person change? Should the organization change, or should you change? Or you ask anything which asks them to reflect on that, they're always going to say other people should change rather than themselves. That's just human nature. We all believe that we're doing the right thing. I think there's very few of us who go around life saying, well, if I just changed a little bit, everything will be fine. It's all, we'll know if you changed, then everything will be fine. So I think that's one thing, is to really bear in mind, how you think about, how people think about change, and directing people to change generally doesn't work. I think the way to show to change is to model change. So certainly think about the way that you behave, how that reflects on people, and how that means that people can think about their own behaviors and how they might change. So for me, I think it's all about demonstrating change and thinking about the structures in the organization which enable people to change in the ways that they work every day, rather than saying you must change, because usually you're going to get a fair bit of resistance for that. So hiring. So yes, job ads and interviews. So if you do a technical screening, get to the cultural questions first. But then I would question whether you even need to do a technical screening. And I know this might start coming across as a little bit controversial. So in my current company, we've actually started moving away from more of the technical interviews. Doesn't mean we don't consider technical skills, because obviously that is part of what people are hired to do. But we used to do a cultural fit interview, and then ask a candidate to do coding homework. So maybe spend 2 or 3 hours of their own time doing some work, and then coming in and doing a pair programming exercise. And we actually reflected on this, and we realized that we don't actually take that much. We were finding that not many people were not making it through the technical side of it, because you've got this you've got a good idea of the person and how they think and their motivations and their problem solving capability during the first interview. And then during the second one, you either got a, well, yes, they're excellent, they just, absolutely nailed it, or a, oh, we're not sure, but then there could have been extenuating circumstances, or, it's too short a period for me to really know. And so what we found was that actually we weren't adding much value, and we were asking people to invest a lot of time without us getting much value out of the process. So now what we do is we combine both the culture and the kind of skills interviews together, and the technical side of it is much more a discussion about bring in some code that you've worked on, if you've had a side project, or you've done other coding tests for other companies, or if you've got an open source project you've contributed to, and just talk about code and think about problem solving in that way, just to really just get a bit of a feel for how somebody thinks about the technical aspects of the job. And then at the end of the day, you hire people, and you have this concept, certainly in Australia, of a probation period, and that's when you really can review whether someone is fitting in with the job or not. And I'll get a little bit into the when people don't work out a little bit later on. So I'm going to look at a few more questions now, since I've reached a natural break. So Manvendra, how do you avoid group thinking and not looking for people who think like you and yet share the same mental model? Yeah, that's a great question, and I've been trying to be careful in my language of not hiring for culture fit necessarily, because culture fit can often be thinks exactly the same as me, thinks does the same things, wants the same things, and it's super hard. I think when you're interviewing people, you naturally gravitate towards people who remind you of you, or answer questions in the same way that you would answer the questions yourself. So I think for me, the main thing is being conscious of it, and knowing that what you're looking for is not necessarily people who think like you, but people who think compatibly with you, and think about the culture that you want to have as well, rather than the culture you have now. So it's certainly a very hard territory to get into. I agree. You want to make sure that you're not just contributing to groupthink. And one of the things which I mentioned actually in a little bit is also having more than one person involved, having a broader team. And that starts to create a virtuous cycle where, because you hopefully have more diverse voices in your hiring process, you hire more diverse voices into the team, who then become part of the hiring process themselves, and hopefully bring on more diversity into your team. So Eric asks, is it feasible to avoid agile terminology and cultural change in some old school organizations, or is agile wording inherent in the change? Oh, that's a great question. So I actually don't really talk about agile. And when I was reading through this, the talk that I did 4 years ago, I talked a lot about agile and agile adoptions. And I realized that certainly in the last 3.5 years that I've been in my existing role, we just don't talk about agile at all. We talk about how we work. We do a lot of the things that come from agile. We do retrospectives, and we inspect and adapt, and we split up work, and we work iteratively, and we seek customer feedback, and we do all of those things, but we don't talk about agile. And I think thinking about how we work, and I quite like ANZ, their program of change is called New Ways of Working, and it encompasses a lot of other things. So I think it's absolutely an option to avoid agile terminology. I think using words like iteration rather than sprint sometimes helps, because it's a little bit more, it's not Scrum, which I'm not going to get into the Scrum versus anything else argument, but I think the more generic you make your, think about what you're trying to achieve rather than what a model or a book says. I will take one more question, because there are a lot coming in, which is great, but I will, I'll intersperse them with the rest. So what processes or structures, this is from Steve, what processes or structures have you seen that share responsibility in managing company culture rather than the influence and decisions of direct line managers? Ah, excellent. Yeah. So Look, absolutely. Company culture is everybody's responsibility, and I've been really pleased with how the business I'm in at the moment has, over a few years, has transformed. When I started, there was a group of leads who would define what the culture is and what we want people to do, and then kind of announce things to the team and say, "This is how we're doing things." Um, and we had a really good introspection, probably 18 months ago. We said, well, why are we doing these behind closed door meetings about things and then going and talking to the team about other things? Why don't we just do it all as a group? And we're lucky that we have a fairly small team. We're about 30 people, but we do a lot now where we don't do closed door leads meetings where we talk about how things should work. We actually engage the whole team. We talk about things. We have a whole team retro where people bring up those kind of meta level things that affect the whole organization or the whole team. And we talk about the solutions and we try things. And we've built a good culture of being able to try things and fail at things. And I hope that I've played my part in modeling that. You know, I come up with ideas for change and things that we should try, but I'm also the first person, if I think they're not working, to say, hey, we should stop doing this thing because it's actively harming us, or because it's not helping in the way we thought. So I think the more you can engage people in change efforts and thinking about what needs to change, can definitely help with getting more people involved in building the company culture. All right, I will continue on. So I mentioned this before in the Q&A segment, around involving the team as well that the candidate would be working with, because this is, I mean, it's bad for the candidate because they're meeting maybe one or two people who may not be representative. But also it's bad for the team if you just kind of say, hey, congratulations, here's your new person, and expect them to, you know, suddenly become part of the team. You know, teams might push back on that if they had no say in that recruiting process. So even if it's, you know, make time for an informal coffee with some of the team, or, you know, in these days, maybe a video call. And if you're doing a technical exercise, you know, instead of doing the coding homework, maybe do a pair programming exercise where they work with one or two people as part of that process, so that they have a chance to figure out, you know, how they work together. So in that technical area, pair programming I think is definitely very useful. If you do want to do a technical exercise, you do get a lot about problem solving. One thing I'd counsel you not to do: please don't try and trip people up. You know, we've all seen instances of these kind of crazy, hilarious technical questions where it's how many balloons would fit in this room, or I don't see how that helps make any decision at all, to be honest. Going for trick questions, or, you know, kind of could you whiteboard this really complicated algorithm on the, you know, on the fly without looking anything up. You know, and again, I come from a software development background, but 99% of my job is Googling things and then figuring out why they work. If I don't have access to Google or a textbook or whatever, then don't expect me to be productive. So why are you testing that in an interview? So the other thing about hiring is thinking about team composition and thinking about where the gaps in a team are, and visualizing the team roles. So there's a really good model, which I like. It's from the 1970s. A guy called Meredith Belbin put together these 9 roles, and they've become the Belbin team roles. The idea being that teams self-assess for each of the members in that team which role that they play in that team, and then you aggregate them all together and you figure out where have you got gaps. So there are 9 roles which come out of the Belbin team model. So the first one is plant. So this is someone who's a creative thinker, comes up with new ideas. So they're kind of the visionary, but they might also be a bit absent-minded. They might lack in the ability to execute on something. You have the resource investigator. So that's someone who starts with a rush, you know, farms ideas and contacts from outside the team, but they can, you know, lose energy at the end of a project. You've got the coordinator. So that's someone who can chair the team. They delegate tasks, but they can be perceived as just doing the delegation and saying you do this and you do that and doing none of the work themselves. You've got a shaper. someone with great energy and passion to complete the task. They'll try and motivate the team. Their downside is that they can become aggressive, because they're quite dry. They can be quite pushy. I'm not keeping up with my slides here. I apologize. Shaper, monitor, evaluator. So that's someone who can they can step back. They can take a fair and balanced view of the work. They can be a bit dry. They can be lacking in inspiration, and maybe they dampen enthusiasm a little bit. You've got team worker, so that's someone who just eases the friction in the team, and it's kind of the glue between the team. They keep smooth over the differences, and they often do it in ways that you don't even notice. However, their kind of downside is they can sit on the fence a little bit when a decision needs to be made. You've got the implementer, who's someone who takes the ideas and the input of others and just turns them into concrete outcomes. And they're the classic person who can be counted on to deliver, but they could be a little bit inflexible and closed-minded. You've got the finisher. So this is someone who has the perfectionist tendencies, likes to go the extra mile, dot the I's, cross the T's. They've got a real appreciation for accuracy, which can be frustrating for the rest of the team if it's in the wrong areas. And then you've got the specialist. So this is someone who loves to learn. They just become that knowledge bank for the rest of the team. They love to get better in their area. They can be very narrowly focused on that area and potentially ignore the other areas that the team needs to focus on. So those are the Belbin team roles. And how you use these is you look at everybody in the team, they self-assess, and remember that one person can play more than one role. So you don't need a team of 9 people to cover all of those roles. But once you map out an existing team and the roles in those teams, if you look for any gaps, that could give you a clue as to where you need to hire. So if you don't have a completer finisher, and everybody's all in the, thinking about great ideas and coming up with the next big thing, but there's nobody actually kind of getting it to shipped, you might have a problem. By the same token, if you have a team of implementers and completer finishers who can get on and create stuff but have none of the vision and the big picture thinking, you might not be working on the right things. So being able to think about those roles, think about the gaps, is a kind of a key thing when you're hiring. I'm going to take another quick question break and drink of water break. Okay, so Justin, on my first 2 points, how much does the fish rots at the head apply to trying to work in an organization that doesn't have the belief at the organizational leadership level? Should people stay at companies and try to affect change when the C-level don't believe in agile, or is it time to move on? Ah, yes, been there. So absolutely, I think you're 100% right. I think a lot of this does come from leadership, and I think having the implicit or explicit buy-in of leadership is very important. And leadership don't have to lead the change necessarily themselves, but they have to enable it. So they do have to give permission, and they can just as easily squash a change if they don't believe in it. And there's the saying that first you should try and change your company, as in change it and remodel it. But if you can't change your company, then you should change your company and go somewhere else and work somewhere else, which the nuclear option, let's be fair, but sometimes, these options won't work. It's absolutely true. Beanish asks, can you recommend any links or resources to share with people who are still very hung up on only looking at specific technical skills and testing in hiring? Ooh, good question. I'm sure I do. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I'd be more than happy to pass some of those out via whichever channels we have to do so after this session. And so asks, for a company may not be ready for a change. How can you convince stakeholders to try culture gardening rather than launching a 2-year program? Now, this is easier if you're already doing some kind of iterative development. If you can prove that you don't need to do a 2-year software development or whatever project you're doing, and actually you can work in small increments and see improvements. If you've been able to prove that already, then you can use that as a proof point for why you should do something like this in an iterative manner rather than trying to launch a 2-year change program. So if you're trying to be agile and work iteratively, you should make your change program iterative. So I think that's kind of one key point to try and get across to the stakeholders. I think the other one is sometimes if you're able to do so, just don't ask permission. Just go and start making changes in small ways, and quite often the changes which happen in small ways will breed larger changes. And certainly, I would, as I said, at my existing company, I don't talk about agile. I don't talk about trying to change culture. I don't do any of that. I go ahead and do it with the team. And I think we've been able to prove that works, and been able to get people on board through that. And we've become a model for the rest of the organization. So bringing people together into a team, we've talked about hiring, but it's not actually just something you do when you're hiring. You quite often think about team structures throughout the life of your organization. So I'm a big believer in long-lived teams, and long-lived, it depends on your organization as to what long means. For us at the moment, it's probably about 6 months. We find that's about the right balance, is that after about 6 months, enough people have joined, or the company has shifted in some of its priorities, or some people have moved on, whatever it might be, that the team structures need to change. There's this concept of an immutable team. So basically an immutable team means that a team can't change. A team either exists or it becomes a new team. So as soon as you add or remove somebody from a team, you've got a new team. Even if 4 of the 5 people have worked together before, as soon as you add someone new into the team, you're changing the dynamics of that team. So trying to focus on long-lived teams means that you don't have to go through all those processes every time you start a new team of getting to know each other, figuring out how each other works, having the arguments about how each other works, maybe hiding the arguments about how each other works and then not getting on, and whatever it might be, the things that happen in teams. But I think when you think about organizational design and setting up team structures, do it on a basis that makes sense for you. So as I say, for us, that's 6 months, but also think about the same principles that we talked about for hiring. So culture is important, skill is secondary to the culture. Because I've seen lots of instances where managers sit in a room, try and design the perfect team structure. So they try and put people over here who have that thing, and that person knows that, so put them over there. And they try and do it based on the skills of the teams, and they don't think about the personal relationships and the different human interactions. I've even seen some who are a bit like school teachers, and if people get on well, they'll try and split them up because we can't have them having too much of a good relationship at work. That's not what work's for. It's supposed to be hard and dull. So I've seen that happen where people kind of sit in a room and just try and work out where people should sit and not think about the relationships. The opposite approach is to allow people to choose the teams that they want to work on. And that could be because of the work the team's doing, but could also just as equally be because of the other people that are in that team that those people want to work with. So there's a great case study, which has been fairly widely shared now, and there's a book about it. Sandy Mamoli and David Mole, both from Trade Me in New Zealand, they actually did got people to figure out what team they want to work on. So they called it squadification. So everybody works for the team they want to work on. They sign up based on the skills that they offer as well as the people that be working on. So they did it by basically throwing everyone in a room and saying, here's the teams, go work out where you want to work on. And there's a little bit more structure to it than that, but essentially it's saying to people, you are the masters of your own destiny. You can figure out where you want to work. And the example they use is they say, well, we do these hackathons every so often, and people swarm together to work on the problems that they want to work on with the people they want to work on. And they do that once a quarter or whatever it might be. Why don't we do that day to day in our normal lives? Why would we, have a different way of working? So they've written a book based on that. And I've got a link to that at the end. And I will also warn you that I'm in the book as well, because I've done it myself. So having learned from Sandy and David, I did it at one organization, and I can tell you it definitely works. So, and that can be a little bit confronting for people if they have to, get out there and say where they want to be. But the more you do it, the more people get comfortable with it. And in my current company, we kind of do a version of it. We actually do it online. So we say these are the 5 or 6 teams that are going to exist. These are the team leads for those teams, and ask people to nominate through Google Forms or a poll which team they want to be in. And we do it on the basis that we can't guarantee you'll get your first preference, but wherever possible, we'll try and put you in your, the team you want to be in. So that's putting teams together and selecting teams. I've gone the wrong way. So I've completely lost control. There we go. All right. So the next thing to talk about is weeds. So beware of weeds. Weeds are crafty. They sneak up without you knowing. Sometimes they trick you into thinking that they're nice plants that you really want in your garden. And then they sap the resources and the nutrients from the environment. And before you know it, your beautiful garden is a weed-choked mess. So you can tell that I'm using a metaphor, yes. Thinking about bad hires. So toxic employees, people who come into the organization or are already in the organization. And it's not necessarily somebody without the requisite technical skills. In fact, quite often they are high performers and they're very productive, and they're the people who, you kind of go, wow, they just churn out so much stuff. They're amazing. However, often what's missed is that they also display toxic behaviors which undermine the rest of the team. So I think I saw a comment earlier on from Ed about the mythical 10-time developer. Not to characterize all 10 times developers as this, but quite often they are also somewhat toxic. And one of the key signs of this is where somebody maybe takes all the credit for something and gives none of the credit to anybody else. So there was a research team at Harvard Business School. So they did some work and they revealed that the average cost of hiring a toxic employee is about 12.5 grand in costs of staff, in the cost of staff turnover. So that's pretty scary if you think about the impact of that, particularly with the Aussie dollar against the US dollar. But 12.5 grand is a lot of money. And quite often companies overlook the negative behavioral aspects because someone is very productive. But the research showed even the top 1% of superstar employees only added about 5.5 grand in value. So if you're comparing that 12.5 grand cost of staff turnover because other people are leaving, or you're seeing that this is having an impact on your team, compared to at best 5.5 grand in value, I think it's pretty clear that you should really be focusing on who are those toxic employees, and no matter if they're just really productive, how do you weed them out of your organization? So the traits that correlated very highly with toxic workers that they found. So one of them was being overconfident. One was being self-centered, productive, and also rule following, which I thought was quite interesting. So as somebody who doesn't necessarily follow the rules, I think that's, we'll see. So that's not to say that everyone with those traits will be toxic, of course, but you should be on the lookout. So a couple more things to talk about. So you've hired great people, you've put them into teams based on what they want to work on and who they want to work with. You've eliminated all your toxic hires. So I'm going to talk about transplanting. And by this, I mean taking your newly bought seedlings, your hired people, and getting them into the organization, and how do you onboard them? And this is a really interesting time to be talking about onboarding new employees. So I don't know about the companies you're working in. We've had a few people start in the last few weeks, and we're all remote. And you think about how hard it is from your experience of starting a new company. You're nervous. You don't know anyone. You don't know the business. You don't know the product. You're maybe sometimes you don't know the technology that the team's working with, and there's all these things, the first day at school syndrome. Now think about that, and you're not going into the office and actually going and being able to meet anyone. You're having to do it all virtually, and you're sitting in your bedroom or in your home office, and that makes it doubly hard, if not more so. So onboarding somebody into the company, it's always a delicate task, whether you're in person or not. So getting the transition right can definitely be very tricky. If you are a gardener, you'll know that taking a seedling and repotting it is a really delicate maneuver. There's a lot of stress, and the same is true of new hires or even new team members. So if you're moving people from one team to another. So onboarding is more than just a tour of the building and saying, toilets are over here, break rooms over there, help yourself to snacks. You want people to feel part of the team. You can read a wiki page to understand, the structure of the code, but you can't do the same to understand the team. So I think it's really important that you get the rest of the team that they're working with to be involved in the onboarding of a new starter. So, there's the basics, which hopefully get covered. So make sure they've got the tools they need to do their job. They've got a seat and a desk and a computer and a screen and whatever that's there waiting for them. But what else can you do, or can the rest of the team do to help them feel welcome? Could you decorate their desk or get them a gift? Some companies provide, a pack of swag for the new starter. And again, once you're remote, this may becomes a bit harder. But another good idea is to, for each new starter, give them a prepaid coffee card if there's a local cafe, and get them to have coffee with 10 people, and say you've got to find 10 people in the organization, take them out for a coffee and get to know them. As I say, maybe that's a little bit harder now that we're not able to actually go out for coffee with each other, but that will change. In the interim, set up video calls with people, make time for people to also engage with their team in a social level as well. And as I said, there's once you reshape your teams and once people move into new teams, you've got this immutable teams concept. So you're going to have to do the same again, as well as thinking about your process for somebody new joining the business, think about your process for re-onboarding someone once they come into a new team. So I've got a question from Steve. So Steve asks, how many people do I think is a minimum number to ask, where do you want to work? So yeah, I guess that depends. I mean, if you've got one team and it's a small team, it may be a somewhat academic question. But we've certainly done it with, I think, 10 to 12 people at one point. And I think we'd split up into 2 or 3 teams, and it was a lot more informal. I've done it with teams of, it was about 120, I think, all in one room. And that was the full kind of in-person in one. And that was a lot more chaotic. But I think it can work for teams of any size, really. So you've onboarded new people, and then you need to nurture them. So you need to grow and develop your people. And I think this goes a little bit back to the hiring discussion as well. Before you even hire somebody, think about, and I think sometimes we're all a bit blind to who in the organization or who in the team who's already there could be good for this role. And this comes down to gaps then. So if you think about, if I've been working in the business in one role for 2 years, and there's another role which comes up, which I can do some of, but I don't have all the skills for. There's 2 different ways you could look at that. One way is you could say, well, you don't have all the skills. I need you to be a project manager. Therefore, I need you to have skills in Microsoft Project or Jira or whatever it might be. And you don't have those skills. But then on the flip side, this person has 2 years of experience of working with the team and with the product and with the culture. And again, we've talked about the value of the cultural skills that people have. You've got to make that call. Is it better, do you actually need somebody who understands these particular technical skills and has the experience in this particular job? Or could you develop somebody who's already in the team show trust in them, show them, you know, that you're willing to invest in them, train them, grow them, help them grow into that role if that's what they want to do. So I think it's always, you know, whenever you have that kind of hiring decision coming up, is think outside the box beyond just, oh, let's stick an advert on Seek and see if we can find the best person who's out on the market at the moment who has the experience that we want, and think about the people who are already in the organization and whether you can develop them. And it's also, I mean, it's something you should be doing well before, you know, the time for them to move comes up. So, you know, I think you have to have a culture which supports and promotes learning. And learning isn't all about big training programs. You know, I think this what we're doing today is a great example. You know, it can be something which costs very little for the company to engage in. You know, whether that's community meetups, whether it's going to conferences like Last, if it's learning within the organization, running, you know, brown bag lunches or book clubs. So a book club where, you know, people all read the same book and learn together every week, and group learning through things like coding dojos. We do a fortnightly, what we've repurposed a brown bag lunch. We actually do it during the mornings, and it's called a knowledge shower, which is a corruption of, I think, knowledge share originally, and somebody misheard it, and so it became a knowledge shower. And that's where we all share knowledge with each other and talk about, you know, these things that can help people grow. So I think building a learning organization is really important. However, I think it's also important to know that inevitably people will leave, whether that be something they choose to do or something that you as an organization choose to do. You know, if you go back to that Jim Collins quotation right at the beginning, you know, the part, get the wrong people off the bus. Sometimes it is your duty to part company with someone who's not working out, or it could be their own choice. Either way, I think the important thing for me is you always treat people and somebody leaving as a learning opportunity for you and for the team. And you treat people with the same respect and dignity as when they join the organization. You know, just because someone said, well, I don't want to work here anymore, you don't suddenly kind of turn around and go, well, fine, you know, and kick up a stink. You know, if somebody was important to you when they started, they're important to you when they leave as well. And I think that, you know, having a learning opportunity, it is a learning opportunity. You can learn a lot when somebody leaves the organization. You can make the organization better. So I mean, my personal philosophy, if somebody chooses to move on, it's almost always too late to try and change their mind. And no matter how valuable someone is to my team and to me personally, maybe, if they choose to leave, I'm always, you know, I'm genuinely excited for them, for their next step. And I'll let them know that. And I also let them know, you know, if circumstances change, and they're welcome to come back. You know, it's always, I've had this a few times where people leave the organization for whatever reason, you know, for career development or for personal reasons. If they come back after an absence, you know, it's always, you know, it's a great, it's a great justification of what you're doing, but also they bring back new experiences with them. So I think, you know, you learn a lot from people who have left the organization and then come back. So that's my time pretty much up. And, you know, my kind of concluding thoughts, you know, would be leading a transformation, whether that be an agile adoption or any other kind of cultural change, is probably one of the most rewarding activities of your working career. So if you do come from a software development background or some technical skills where you can see that immediate change, you know, with a software program, you make a change, you run the program, you can see that it's changed. Did you do the right thing or not? It's just this instant feedback. It's great. Leading things is hard. You know, you don't get that instant feedback if you don't decide to do one-on-ones with your team, or you don't do, you know, you don't communicate effectively. The impacts of that could be very delayed, and you have very long feedback loops on that. So it is hard, but it's just so rewarding. And when you look at companies who run good teams, treat them as a source of inspiration. So as I said earlier, don't just try and blindly copy what they've done, but be inspired by them. None of them came into being by magic. They were, you know, the result of months, years of work to get to that state. And they all started with someone, you know, just like you. So get your gloves on, ready to watering can, and get to work growing a great team. Here's a couple of books. I'm gesturing that way because that's where it is on my screen, maybe down there or something. There is a list of books. So Good to Great is the book I mentioned earlier, where that Jim Collins quote comes from. There's the version 1 CollabNet State of Agile survey is always an interesting read. As I say, their next one is coming out in, I think, around about May of this year. The Belbin team roles are described in this book, published by Belbin themselves, Team Roles at Work, and the story of self-selection and how Sandy and David did that at Trade Me is in the Creating Great Teams book, and that's an excellent book, very highly recommended, as are all of these. So that was me done.